Okay, hello everybody. So today we continue our discussion in macroeconomics, and the model we are going to discuss is the so-called ASAD, or Aggregate Supply and Aggregate Demand model. And as we will see today, this model is closely linked to our ISLM model we already discussed in one of our previous lectures. So it's just a continuation of the business cycle theory we have discussed in the previous parts. So let me start and explain this model by looking first to the demand side, the so-called aggregate demand curve, and therefore we call it AD for aggregate demand, just using the first letters. And then I will do in a second part, I will show you the supply curve, the AS curve, putting both curves together. And then we will discuss one simple example. We already discussed in class the so-called classical dichotomy, but this time we will discuss the same issue just in this ASAD model. So let me talk about the aggregate demand curve. Well, first of all, we already learned a lot about the ISLM model. Investment saving liquidity money model. And this model was represented, as you remember, in a space of income on the horizontal axis and the interest rate on the vertical axis. What we will see, the key difference to the ADAS model is that now income once again is on the horizontal axis, but on the vertical axis, it's not the interest rate. Now we have the price level on the vertical axis. So that is the key difference. But in the end, you will see that both models, the ISLM and the ADAS curve, are quite similar. So what you can show and explain in ISLM is also possible to show and illustrate in the ASAD framework. So this is what you all know, the ISLM model. IS curve is downward sloping, which is representing the goods market equilibrium. LM curve is upward sloping, which is representing the money market equilibrium. On the horizontal axis, once again, we have output, GDP, and on the horizontal axis, we have the interest rate, R. But now, what I do, I derive the so-called aggregate demand curve, the AD curve. And the AD curve is directly coming from ISLM. So what I'm going to do to illustrate this, well, I assume that the price level increases from P0 to P1. So there's an increasing price level. Well, we already discussed what is happening in this case. The price level affects the money market. So the LM curve is affected, yeah? My LM curve is affected, and in the end, it will shift the LM curve to the left. And that is what you can see in this graph. Due to a higher price level, we will move from here to our new equilibrium here. So what we see, that output is going down, but the price level, as I already said, that was the key assumption, is higher in this equilibrium. So if I illustrate now a curve where we have output in the beginning at price level P0, and then we have seen from the ISLM model, if we increase the price level to P1, yeah, we have a higher price level and we get a lower output level. So that gives me a point here. So in other words, the AD curve is also a downward sloping curve. Yeah? And that is what we call AD. The only difference, keep in mind, now we have here on the vertical axis, not the interest rate, the real interest rate, we have the price level. So the AD, the aggregate demand curve, is a downward sloping curve in the space output on the horizontal axis and price on the vertical axis. Now we have to discuss, as we already did for the ISLM, in the ISLM model, what are the factors that shift the curve to the left and to the right? Well, this is quite simple, because all the factors you already know that are shifting the IS all the LM curve to the right will shift the AD curve to the right. And all the factors shift the IS curve and the LM curve to the left, what we already discussed in the ISLM model, will affect my AD curve and shift the AD curve to the left. So there is nothing new. You just have to use the knowledge we already learned about the ISLM model and the factors that shift the ISLM model, and then you know already in which direction the aggregate demand curve is shifting. For instance, we discussed that a higher consumption shifts the IS curve to the right. And as long as the IS curve shifts to the right, you know immediately the AD curve, the aggregate demand curve. So this curve will shift to the right. So higher consumption shift IS to the right, and it will also shift my aggregate demand curve to the right. And vice versa. Lower consumption, as we know from the ISLM model, shift the IS curve to the left, and therefore AD curve shifts to the left. So nothing has changed as long as you remember all the factors we discussed. Higher investment, shift IS curve to the left, will also shift to the right, will also shift the AD curve to the right. And the same for government spending and the same for net exports. So no difference. All the factors that have an impact to the ISLM model have an impact to the aggregate demand curve in the same direction as the impact is in the ISLM model. And that is the beauty of these two models, because they are so similar and the factors are almost the same. But there's a new element in the aggregate supply and demand model. So far we talked about the demand curve. Now let me talk about the supply curve, the aggregate supply curve. And actually that is the new element in this model framework, the supply side. In the ISLM, you can say that is just demand side framework. There is no supply. But now we introduce also an aggregate supply. Well, in brief, the supply side is determined by the production function. We talked already about the production function in one of the previous lectures when we talked about the Solow model. And in general, here we distinguish between two supply curves, a long-run supply curve and a short-run supply curve. And interestingly, in both cases, the supply curve has a certain shape. So once again, we have output on the horizontal axis and price on the vertical axis. And in the long run, as I show here on my slide, the supply curve is vertical. So it's just a line at a certain output level, y. You can say this is the output in the long run, the potential growth rate we also talked about in the Solow model. And that is a certain trend, and that trend is given. So the long run supply, keep in mind, is a vertical line. If we take a look to the short run supply curve, same framework, output on the horizontal, price on the vertical axis. The short run supply curve, well, usually it is an upward sloping curve. In an extreme case, you can say it is horizontal. Yeah, it's the opposite. Well, it's the opposite of vertical. Yeah? In an extreme case, you can say the supply curve is horizontal, but in most realistic cases, the supply curve is upward sloping. And that brings me back to an issue of supply and demand you already studied in microeconomics in the first semester, right? Demand curve was always downward sloping, and that is what we also got here. Aggregate demand was a downward sloping curve. Supply curve in microeconomics, always upward sloping, right? And that is also what we have here in the most realistic case. The supply curve in the short run is upward sloping. However, in the long run, it is fixed and vertical. So here's once again this illustration. Long run supply curve, we use the short LRAS for long run. Aggregate supply is a vertical. And in short run, it's an upward sloping curve. I use SR for short run, or yeah. aggregate supply, it's this upper sloping curve, and here I also have already this downward sloping AD curve. And that brings together aggregate supply and aggregate demand. And the intersection of supply and demand gives me my equilibrium. In this equilibrium, obviously, we find output, GDP in equilibrium, and we find the so-called equilibrium price P. So far you would say, well, there's nothing new to the ISLM model, but now I will discuss one case with the ASAD model, the so-called money neutrality, which we already discussed in the ISLM framework, but you will see that in this model you see the idea of the money neutrality far better in this framework. And therefore we have these two complementary models. Yeah? They are explaining the same things, but in some model you can see the issues better than in the other model, dependent on the question you ask. Okay, keep in mind, IS, LM, and ADAS are very similar. You can say they are almost equivalent. The only difference here is that on the vertical in the ISLM is the interest rate, in the ADAS it's a price level. Same assumptions, and it's very useful sometimes to use ISLM or the other model, ADAS, dependent on the question. And now I will illustrate this here. So I will discuss monetary policy in the long run and in the short run. And that is also called, what you already know from our previous discussion in classes, money neutrality or the classical dichotomy. So let me start. Suppose we have this long run, as we know, supply curve, which is a vertical, and now I use the extreme case of the short run supply curve as a horizontal. You can also do it for an increasing, but let's assume in extreme the supply curve is horizontal and the downward sloping curve is the demand curve. Okay. We discuss monetary policy. So suppose money supply, this M, increases. As we already learned from ISLM, if there is a larger M, an increase in money supply, the LM curve shifts to the right. If the LM curve shifts to the right, then we know the AD curve, which is coming from ISLM, that is what I showed you a minute ago, will also shift to the right. So higher money supply shifts in the IS-LM model, the LM curve to the right, and if the LM curve shifts to the right, the AD curve will shift to the right. That is what I illustrated here. So we started in point A, and now, after the increase in money supply, the AD curve shifts to the right, and we are in point B. Well, what we can see immediately now, in the short run, we are on the short run curve. In the short run, that leads to a higher output, to higher GDP. So monetary policy helps to stimulate the economy in the short run. But what we can see immediately in the long run, obviously, so this is now my new AD, the demand curve. And in the long run, obviously we are here, demand, intersection, and my long run supply curve. So in the long run, output is not affected. We are back to the initial output. However, what is different in the long run, we have a higher price level. And that is actually what we call the classical dichotomy. In the short run, monetary policy is effective. It has an impact on output. But in the long run, we are back to the initial output, but we have a higher price level. So the nominal variable is higher, but the real variable, output, what we have produced, is the same. So there's a separation of real variables, which is the same, and nominal variables, which stay. And that is actually what I have illustrated here. So you can see in the long run, we are ending here. Also the supply curve, the short run supply curve shifts up because we have this higher price level. So we move from starting point A in the short run to point B, and in the long run, we are ending in equilibrium C. And only in short run, monetary policy is effective. In short run, when we move back to point C, you see there is no impact of monetary policy. The only impact we have in the long run is a higher price level. And that is obviously not really good, because usually if the price level is higher but the income is the same, we have lost purchasing power. So we can buy less products with our income, with our money in the pocket. And that is what we call the money neutrality. In the long run, money is neutral. In the short run, it's effective. And we already studied the same in the ISLM model, and now I illustrated here the same issue in the ADAS model. So keep in mind, both models are closely linked, but for illustrating, for instance, the money neutrality, the ADAS model is far better, because here you can really see the difference in short and in the long run. In the ISLM model, you cannot really see this effect, but you can discuss it in the ISLM model. Okay, so that's it for today. That was a short introduction into the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. Bye-bye.